All right, welcome to a very special episode of the Comic Watchers. I'm Chad, and that's not Matt. That is Anthony. How's it going, man? How's it?
Good, good. Just got done watching the Acolyte like you, and excited to talk about it.
I think we've worked together for a couple, maybe a few years now, and this is the first
Mhm.
time we've actually had a chance to, interact face to face. So I'm glad to finally get the chance.
Yeah, likewise.
So let's get started. The Acolyte. It's the latest Disney Plus show. Star Wars in the Star Wars saga. It takes place 100. I think it's 132 years before the Phantom Menace, during the near the end of the High Republic, which is supposed to be the golden age of the Jedi, and it's in the show was like a murder mystery. Do you want to add anything to kind of that very brief and
Um, yeah, I mean, it takes place during the High Republic era. If you're a Star Wars fan who's read some of the newer comics or even some of the books, you'll be a little familiar with that era. Um, but it's fairly self-contained. I mean, you don't really need to know anything about the original Star Wars series to watch it. It's a all the characters uh, are unique. They're their own characters. I think some show up in like books and comics and stuff, but everyone is fairly unique in the
Esther
show.
Rao does?
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think she's the only one. I mean, I think she was like a Padawan during the time that the big, well, everybody in Star Wars, be it Jedi or Sith, like build big space stations, and they get
Hmm.
blown up. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, so kind of if you want to kind of give a rundown of what the show was happened during the show, I mean that's fine. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, so it starts out like you said with the murder mystery, which right away I was kind of shocked going into it because it doesn't really present itself as much of a mystery right away. You immediately see who the murderer is, and they waste no time in really explaining who this character is, why the character is doing what they're doing. And I don't know how spoiler we want to be right away, but it essentially is a story about not as much of who the killer is, but why the killer is and why the killer is doing what they're doing. And obviously involves the Jedi, involves a Sith character, and it's gets pretty crazy as the show goes on.
and I was talking about this earlier with somebody else today, but I think this is one of the first, if not the first, like non-linear Star Wars stories that has been told, because usually it's you know everything happens sequentially, but if things happen in other places, it's also during the same time that the other stuff is going on. This kind of it had you had the flashbacks to the 16 years, and you had the flat jump forwards and all that. So I that was kind of a nice touch to see that incorporated into the storytelling.
Hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. It adds a level of getting to really kind of know these characters in a way that it, in the original trilogy, the prequels, I mean, the prequels obviously told a story about characters that showed up in the original trilogy when they were younger, but when you watch the original trilogy and Luke says, or sorry, when Obi-Wan tells Luke about how he fought in the Clone Wars with Luke's father, that's really all you get about it. You don't get
Yeah,
what that looked like. But in this show, they reference events and then they go back and show what those events were, and it creates kind of a whole story that isn't. It doesn't need to be reliant on other pieces of media, really.
yeah, and I found the characters to be very interesting. Soul was a very interesting character. I mean, he starts out kind of like, oh, he's the good guy, and then he gets he kind of ends kind of sketchy, and it it was a nice way that they kind of played that off throughout the show, and um, kind of developed that character. as much as they could with it, given the 8 episodes that they had.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, one of the themes I really enjoyed, and this was really apparent from the first episode, so it was kind of funny to me to see people, I wouldn't say hating on it, but people really kind of against this, like they were surprised. But from the beginning of the show, they say, "Hey, the Jedi are not really the best kind of people in the galaxy. I mean,
Hmm.
they're they're fallible." And honestly, and I've had conversations with friends about this as well, where it much of Disney Star Wars, like it or hate it, has been about what Luke says in The Last Jedi, where he talks about the hubris of the Jedi and how they were their own undoing and how they were so full of themselves and all high and mighty. And this show, straight from the get go, it displays that perfectly. And
Hmm.
it shows a Jedi who are arrogant, full of themselves, and as I'm sure we're going to be talking about, willing to lie to kind of keep that myth about themselves alive in various situations.
Right, and I think that's what I would say a lot of people's perception of the Jedi was going into this. They're the guardians of the galaxy, not to jump
Yeah.
jump, but they're the ones who are right. They're the ones who do what's right, and it's the other people who kind of are the ones that are the bad or the more morally corrupt ones. When this shows that they're fallible also, and have can are pursuing their interests, or pursue have a agenda, kind of an agenda of their own, um, rather than just being the peacekeepers, which at this point they're supposed to be, because
Mm-hmm.
you know there's they haven't been drafted into becoming part of the Republic's army, and actually they're trying very hard to maintain that separation between getting involved and being the Jedi that you know Jedi that they are.
Yeah, the first character that you really get that impression from is Yord, who in the first episode when Osha is arrested necessarily, and Yord is arresting her, and the entire time he's talking to her about how she failed to become a Jedi and how she's too emotional and how she's clearly guilty, and like there was just it was guilty until proven innocent because he was just so full of himself. And his character, I definitely think, has a growth before episode 5.
Mhm.
But it was apparent right off the bat there that it was like, okay, so these are highly arrogant Jedi who know and believe in their hearts that they're the ones who are right about everything. They think that their way is it's their way or the highway. That's represented later in the show as well when Venestra is talking to the council person in the Senate, and it's the same kind of thing. Like, what do you mean you want to oversee us? We're the best in the galaxy. We're the coolest people there are, and it's like, well, I mean, yeah, no, not really. But and
and
that's even before all this stuff is revealed about
and I think having like I've read like the Light of the Jedi, which is kind of the book that kind of kicked it off by Charles Soule, and then
them.
I've kind of slowly gotten, after reading a couple of the in the first wave, I said, okay, I just want to go back to the second wave, which jumps back another 100 or so years, and you kind of get a lot of the story, and you can see that first off, the Jedi aren't the only ones who use the Force, or have a connection to the Force, and you know they somehow they come out as the main group
Hmm.
that seems to be the Force group,
Yeah.
and that's really shown that, I guess, that hubris that has grown out of what has come before really is really shown in this series. But for me, it would have been nice to have you know even if in the first episode saying this is the High Republic. It's the golden age of the Jedi. There was the a lot of stuff has happened. There's many groups of Force users. There was the great Force you know convocation where the Battle of Jeddah, where things kind of went to hell, and then you had and that kind of led to the creation of the Nihil, and that's kind of where the comic books and the series are right now, and the TV show just kind of you know I mean it's fine because it makes it I would say it kind of doesn't bring that all that baggage into it, but it would have been nice to have at least some sort of background. Like I was also telling someone else, it's like we always say, like when there's a comic book movie that comes out, it's like you know you they don't say if you want more of the story, there's more of the story. This is it. This is just part of the story.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. The Nile play like a huge part as the antagonists who are essentially kind of like pirates. I mean,
Yeah.
they serve a kind of unique purpose where they're definitely not like the Sith or like any other Star Wars villain that's come before. But I was a little shocked that they didn't mention them at all in the series. And I get that they want it to be self-contained, but you're right. I mean, you want people to be reading these books, reading these comics. I mean, I believe there's even a children's animated short show
Hmm.
that they released where in the High Republic, and like, I mean,
Well,
yes,
it's like PJ Masks, but it's like
yeah,
Star Wars.
but it's all in this
Yeah.
universe, and I mean, it's a little shocking to me that they didn't want to tie it in too much to that, but they did, like we said with Venestra. She's a character who kind of exists in both. Um, there's some other cameos in the last episode that definitely tie into some other stuff. But for the most part, it's so self-contained, and I think it works to the show's benefit and detriment. Um, it's self-contained to the point where longtime fans of Star Wars, they're not going to find that super huge nostalgia factor in the most obvious ways. But it also is really good for new audiences to say, like, well, what's this story kind of about? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for all intents and purposes, for like what the theme is of the show, like if you watch the Acolyte and then you go and watch the prequels afterwards, it paints a very very different light of who the Jedi are
Mm-hmm.
and what exactly led to their downfall. And you could even skip the prequels. You could watch it and then watch the original trilogy, and all the Jedi are practically wiped out. And you go, I could probably make the leap in logic to see why that happened, but it so it makes sense. And I mean, there's also a lot of mysteries that are not revealed in the first season because they definitely, I mean, spoilers for the last episode, but it ends in a way that is open for a second season in several regards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think I read somewhere, and who knows what you ever you read on the internet is you know hearsay or whatever, but I guess the plans are to kind of tell the story of I'm just gonna go and say who it is.
Mhm.
Darth Plagueis,
Mhm.
who is Sidious's master, and whose story was kind of explored in the book by who is it uh, Bakudo or something. I can't remember,
Mhm.
it's Plagueis is the novel, and it's
Mhm.
basically it doubles as telling Darth Plagueis's story and origin along and how it um, interacts with how Palpatine came to power and became a Sith and all that stuff. So
Mhm.
it'll kind of be interesting to see how they kind of weave that in there because I know they talk about the witches kind of manipulate they didn't create it out of the force, they manipulated the force, and
Mhm.
I kind of I kind of took that divergence was might have been caused by from when the from the great hyperspace disaster when all the Jedi had to focus, all together to keep everything from, going to hell once the Nihil kind of put the spaceship in the hyperspace lane and you had ships falling all over the galaxy
Mhm.
um, because of that.
Yeah, the witches are an interesting topic of the show because on the one hand, I mean, any like heavy Star Wars fan or even some lighter Star Wars fans who have been familiar with like the witches of Dathomir will know who those characters are and kind of that there's existence of other uses of the Force in the galaxy, and that's even explored in like the Ahsoka show, and
Mm-hmm.
it's mentioned in the Mandalorian, and even in the video games. There's mention of that stuff. That more so in the Clone Wars than anything else. But now we're getting the view of another group of space witches who act in a very different capacity. Almost, I mean, you could definitely say the Dathomir witches were very cult like, but these ones were like very cult like. Like they were
Yeah,
very like, and they had that idea of the string, the string of the
the
Force,
thread, the thread.
the
Yeah,
thread. Yes, yeah,
it's the
and
Force,
that
and always will
was
be the Force. That's what we refer to it on this show.
yeah. It's interesting. It's so interesting that and well, I guess the more interesting thing for me was all the pushback that people
Mm-hmm.
gave online about it, and people were so mad about these witches, this coven of space witches who use the Force, and I'm like, well, first of all, it's been done in Star Wars before, but also, I mean, it's a galaxy far away with these crazy Force wielding religious people. Like it's not that far fetched, but they but I got exactly what you said, that the during that great calamity and the disaster in hyperspace, that this emergence that grew was as a result of that, and they manipulated it to create these seemingly twins, which it again, a lot of people online were very upset that that happened because they're like, well, but Anakin should be the only one born as the chosen one, and they clearly were not like the chosen one children, but
Yeah, they never refer to them as the chosen ones.
mhm. Yeah, it's really interesting though. I mean, and unfortunately, I mean, they're in technically like two episodes, but it's really just one flashback story, and then they're all dead. So you don't really see much more of them afterwards. But I mean, the power thing where she like turns into smoke and uh, starts to do something that we never really get to see. Like, I'm interested to see what that ultimately would have been and what would
or
it turn into.
or if she somehow that allowed her to survive. I mean,
Hmm.
I for a while there I thought that perhaps she was kind of the one pulling. She survived and somehow found May, and then was pulling this May's strings and kind of leading her, to the path of vengeance and stuff like that.
Hmm. Yeah, and that definitely would have made sense in the narrative of the show. I mean, but it yeah, it goes in ways, and I'm not going to say the show was perfect because there was a lot of issues I think I had with the show, which ironically were like problems that I don't think anyone else was complaining about. It's just things that I noticed, but like just on the positive side of things, though, I mean, our bad character, Kamir, or
Yeah, yeah,
he he was probably one of the best Star Wars villains that's Disney's has made so far. I mean, super menacing, great action sequences, obviously, but like just the even the way that the actor whose name I don't remember portrayed the character. At first, you have this kind of doofusy, like uh, almost
aloof.
like yeah, aloof, almost like drug dealer kind of guy who's just kind of going around in the galaxy doing his thing. And then as soon as he reveals himself, it's like, oh, that's a completely different guy. And he has that one moment in that episode where he turns to May and goes, "Oh, hey, May," and like just it puts on that face for a second and then switches it back, and I'm like, all right, you sold me on this guy. And then he goes on to kill like 15 Jedi. But it that was probably my favorite part of the whole show, was seeing his journey, and his manipulation of Osha was just fantastic.
And I kind of thought that he was. I mean, they really don't come out and say it, but you get the impression that he was perhaps a Padawan of Venestra,
Mm-hmm.
and those scars on his back were whips that she must have given him with her
Mm-hmm.
lightsaber whip, and so um, yeah, it was. I mean, it was at first when I realized who it was, I was like, okay, I hope I can watch him because he was such a different character in The Good Place, and so it's like, but I kind of I kind of get the feeling that he's being used as a pawn
Oh, for
also,
sure.
and um, if there's a second season, then we'll I think we'll get a you know where it's revealed that Plagueis is using is he's part of Plagueis's plan to kind of set up get the Jedi discombobulated, get the Republic discombobulated to the point where he can start to influence Palpatine once he meets him
Mm-hmm.
on Naboo.
Well, and there's the whole plot too that, I mean, it's all told in Palpatine's kind of his the story he tells Anakin, the famous story about Darth Plagueis the Wise, and about how he was seeking eternal life. And clearly, I mean, you see the concept of the Vergence and the Force creating twins, and it's like, well, that looks like his in the situation. And I know the people famously talk about George Lucas saying that it's like poetry, it rhymes, and it's all cyclical, and it's almost as if he's doing the same kind of plan that the Emperor was doing in Return of the Jedi, where the Emperor's like kind of coaxing Darth Vader into getting his son so that he can kill off Anakin and be like, okay, now Luke's my new Padawan. And like,
Mm-hmm.
and I got the sense in this show that even though Plagueis doesn't have any lines and he's kind of just there in the back, that he's observing and he's aware of the situation, and he's almost coaxing his Padawan or his apprentice into getting an acolyte, and getting this specific acolyte that he can then turn into his own apprentice and steal the power from. And I saw an article that the showrunner was commenting on, where she basically said, well, we've all seen the prequels. We know that Palpatine was the apprentice of Plagueis, and then he had his own apprentices. So, like, clearly it doesn't end very well for May or Osha or Kamir or any of these characters. Like, Plagueis is going to come out on top. So I think you're right that this next season is going to definitely focus on Plagueis a lot more.
Well, I mean, and if we're talking about possible like ways that this transfers from the end of the Acolyte into leading into the prequel, I don't know if you've read the novel Rise of the Red Blade, but it is about it's about one of the Jedi who becomes one of the Inquisitors under Darth Vader and the Emperor, and in the end she commits suicide because that she still has that internal battle inside of her, wanting to be good, and she's found love, and she they try to kill Vader, and but I kind of feel like that might be the and OSHA's going to go down the path. I mean, we saw for the first time the lightsaber actually had the kyber crystal bleed and turn red. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, that was awesome.
You're like, oh, that's what's happening. I mean, that was a nice Easter egg for those of us who really are into the lore
Mm-hmm.
of the Star Wars, and um, but yeah, I just feel like it's you know, in the grand scheme of things, Plagueis is kind of manipulating everything as he tends to do. Because he really doesn't. I think when Palpatine tells Anakin that Darth Plagueis was looking to be, he was experimenting. He was always in the book. He's experimenting. He's not being very successful.
Hmm.
He's able to keep one of his rivals alive, but he's not successful in achieving the immortality that he is. So and so Palpatine kind of stretches the truth, or I guess to use the phrase, tells Anakin from a certain point of view
Hmm.
what's going on.
Yeah, and as much as Rise of Skywalker is kind of reviled amongst the Star Wars community, but it it establishes that the only way the Emperor was able to kind of achieve his goal of that prolonged life was through cloning.
Mhm.
Um, so it definitely, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if Plagueis does any. He's not going to do cloning, I think, but I think he's definitely going to go through, like you said, experiments and stuff,
Mhm.
and kind of, and maybe this whole thing is just one big experiment for him. It's just to
I
see,
mean,
hey.
yeah, but that's kind of for the cloning part. I think that's what I like about what Dave Filoni has done with as the architect. He's kind of not only is all like Clone Wars goes into Bad Batch, which also then leads over, connects into Star Wars Rebels, and so on and so on. But he's started to bring in certain of those legends type story points that would explain how Palpatine came back. With
Mhm.
because in Clone Wars you have or not Clone Wars, in Skeleton Crew, um, in Bad Batch you have the bad you have the things with what's the clone? I was just watching it last night. Omega, yeah, she's
Mhm.
in. They're on Tantus, which is a pull from the original Thrawn series from Timothy Zahn with uh, Sabayoth, which I don't hope we don't see, but it's all connecting, and I was just
Mhm.
kind of trying to look for those connections um, in the show, and I really wasn't kind of seeing them at this point.
Mhm. Yeah, and well, I almost think the show didn't want to go there because I think that is treaded ground that Filoni has been doing a lot. I mean, there's that whole plot at the third season of The Mandalorian with uh, what's his name, Giancarlo Esposito's character
Yeah.
cloning
Uh,
himself. Um, but there's that whole plot, and like it definitely is leading up to kind of explaining that, which is a little sad that like Star Wars has to retroactively go back and explain that plot point from the 2019 movie that people were like, okay, that's kind of stupid that somehow Palpatine returned. But yeah, I mean this show for the Acolyte at least has a lot of potential to, I wouldn't say distance itself from that, but like it definitely has a chance to make it its own kind of Star Wars property. And
mhm.
I think the most unique part of the show is what we touched on in the beginning is the idea that the Jedi are not the best people in the galaxy. They're not the heroes they pretend to be. And and we could talk about the kind of the betrayal that happens, which kind of sets
Yeah,
it off.
it starts with a lie and it ends with a lie,
Yeah, exactly.
and the 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 Venestra, who was all hot and bothered about Soul and the group lying, turns around and practically does the same.
Exactly. And it's, I mean, it's clearly showing, the Jedi, like they're not all, I mean, I don't want to say all of them are bad people, but because clearly the young Padawan character, what was her name? Uh,
Jackie.
yeah, She
Three
I
hole
think
Jackie.
yeah, she was very altruistic. I mean, and
Mhm.
obviously it was like the young naivete, of the younger Padawan, but just the betrayal overall, even the stuff with Soul, which that's what was kind of the most compelling part to me was that even at the end of everything, Soul still believed what he did was right. And that was almost heartbreaking in and of itself. That it was like, Soul, you and your own ambition to have a Padawan uh, allowed yourself to say, well, this one can die because this one's cooler and she likes me. And also, I'm going to just break into the fortress because, like, I want this Padawan for myself. And he, like, almost retroactively convinced himself that, well, I was doing it because you needed saving and you were in a bad spot. And then, like, I mean, talk about commentary like on the real world, but like you have the just that narrative of, well, we're doing the right thing because we're good people, on my definition of good people versus like
Yeah.
what actual good would be. And it was just heartbreaking to see that even in death, Soul was still like, I I did what I should have done, and he
Mhm.
still dies.
Well, I kind of also like the fact that this show kind of made stuff a little more adult. Like I would show my 7-year-old, the Mandalorian. I might show him, you know, Ahsoka. He's watched a little bit of the Clone Wars and stuff like that. I doubt that I would, let him watch this because first off, I don't think he would understand, and I think it's more for it's kind of a deeper, more complex, uh, dealing with
Mhm.
more complex, you know, issues than just something that a young viewer would be able to understand.
Definitely, and the even the violence. I mean, the episode 5, which just is the entire episode is just Kamir massacring this group of Jedi. Just it's very graphic and brutal. I mean, it the one thing this show does that's really unique in Star Wars is it focuses a lot on the hand to hand combat style of things. I mean,
Hmm.
Kamir legitimately snaps Yord's neck, like, and it's not like he grabs his head and the camera pans away. You see him do the whole thing, and it's like, okay, I mean, this show means business. I mean, he kills Jecki, and it's right there on screen. You see the lightsaber blades go right through her, and it's like, they're not trying to hide anything. And even the final fight that he has with Soul in the last episode is just it's a lot more of that like choreographed action, but it's a brutal fight. It's not They're not pulling punches. One of the main criticisms I always had growing up watching the prequels was the the choreography was just so obvious in the prequels. I mean, you have that one shot in Revenge of the Sith where Anakin and Obi-Wan are like twirling their lightsabers around themselves like when they're not even hitting each other, and you're like, all right, what are we doing here? But I felt in this show that all of every swing of the lightsaber mattered. It was
Hmm.
especially when Kamir was swinging his lightsabers. He was doing it to kill every single time. He was always going for the kill no matter what he was doing. And I mean, his the cortosis, the armor he had, the
Yep.
helmet and the band, that was awesome to see, because you see it happen, you go, oh, what was that? And then it happens again, and you're like, okay, now I'm kind of figuring it out. And it was, I
And
mean,
that
that yeah.
and that was another like nice deep pull from everything that's happened because Cortosis was, I think, originally introduced in the Legends I Jedi, but then in the second Thrawn book that's in actual continuity, when it kind of goes back and forth between the first meeting of Anakin and Thrawn, and then while they're Vader and Thrawn, then that's what when during the war, the Clone War, that's what they're investigating. That the Separatists are looking to incorporate that into the robot's armor, and so that was kind of a nice whole uh, nice pull to introduce into the show, as it's not been done before.
Hmm. Yeah, it there was a lot of I liked that the callbacks and that stuff were subtle, and the references to legends were subtle enough that it kind of added to that. And like when we talk about Dave Filoni's pulls into legends, I mean, the first big one obviously was when he brought Darth Maul back, um, and I remember clearly when that only existed in Legends and thinking like, oh, that would be so cool. And then when he actually did it in Clone Wars, I was like, all right, he got me. And then I think that some of the other big ones, obviously Thrawn. Thrawn was huge when he brought Thrawn back in Rebels. And just a lot of that stuff that Filoni was willing to bring back. And I think he actually opened the gate for a lot of the stuff that they were able to do in this show. And I mean, the biggest Legends canon, which a lot of people still think because it hasn't really been negated in any way, is the Old Republic.
Well, I think
And
that, but I still think that they can still do that because
mhm,
they've set you have the Skywalker saga, you have the High Republic, but even in the early books of the High Republic, they mention uh, the original planet that the Sith came from, and collecting the one of the Force cults, the cult of the open hand, which eventually becomes the Nihil. They are going around and collecting different artifacts, both from the Jedi and the Sith. Um, and that's why I kind of thought that Kamir's character was going to have some association with the Nihil, because not only of having a red lightsaber, but also the Darth teeth thing. That kind of from the description of what's his face, Martian Rowe. That's kind of the the way that alien race looks with the teeth.
well, and there's a spot kind of towards the end of episode 5 where Kamir is uh, taking Osha back to his planet. And when he goes to pick her up, you hear a little bit of Kylo Ren's theme. And
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of theory of, well, maybe he's actually one of the progenitors of the Knights of Ren, which
Yeah.
I've also seen a lot of people comparing the Nile to the Knights of Ren and saying,
Mm-hmm.
well, those they were probably a huge, like way back when, like they stuck around in like various eras and became the Knights of Ren. And that's another possibility if we're talking about kind of what Star Wars could be in the future, is that if they don't want to kill off this character, they could have him maybe have a death or a pretend death where he escapes and kind of starts to form, or maybe gets together with the Nile and starts to form the Knights of Ren. That way, you still can have his characters exist and be cool over there, while also saying, yes, the stuff with Plagueis, the stuff we know happened, still happened. But again, that's all conjecture and theory. It's
Yeah.
not, you know.
I mean, just because because of the rule of two doesn't mean that there aren't more Sith out there.
Yeah.
Sith out there. I mean, it's just that that was Darth Bane, who is in canon. Um, not the story that is in the book trilogy, but he was brought again. Dave Filoni brought him into canon during the final season of the Clone Wars, when he had Yoda visit, when Yoda was learning the way that he could, appear after his death to kind of help, you know, the next generation, right the wrongs that the Jedi were unable to prevent this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the rule of two I always thought was a funny thing because it Dave Filoni plays with it so much in his Star Wars canon that he kind of started establishing uh, with George Lucas at the beginning and then post George Lucas after Lucas stepped away. But the idea that, well, the rule of two definitely applies to the specific Sith at the time, but when Maul came back, Maul had his brother kind of become his apprentice, And Maul said, well, no, we're the two. You guys are another two over there. So there was four Sith kind of going around at the time, and they both were an argument of who the two were. And obviously Maul never, he didn't die until much later, but like the rule of two, I think, is just kind of funny because it creates different sects of of Sith in different spots who all think that they're the two. And
Right.
that's exactly what could happen here is that Kamir goes off and does his own thing with Osha, and Plagueis is like, "Well, he's not my two. Where's Palpatine? Let's go have an adventure together."
Yeah.
It's like okay, cool. So that and they have every possibility of doing that, and it it's funny because it's kind of like that idea that like the Sith and the Jedi are like two sides of the same coin, where it's like they both think they're like the right in the situation and they're the almighty ones, and well, you're stealing the power from us and we're stealing the power from you, and but it's like both of them were just wrong in every way about their ideas.
And kind of off topic, but I like how the Acolyte kind of paid a lot of attention to details, like Kanaka's ship. It was made out of wood, which in uh, canon, the Wookiee ships are made. The wood from Kashyyyk are strong enough that they can be used for spaceships. And if you get a good look at his lightsaber hilt, it looks like it's also wood, which
Mm-hmm.
again was a nice kind of touch, for the Star Wars, geek to
Yeah.
kind of pick up.
Well, and the High Republic books and comic books have a Wookiee Jedi. I don't remember what his
Mm-hmm.
name is, but
Yeah, I
uh,
can't remember his name either.
I recall when the trailer for the show first came out, I thought, oh, okay, well, it's obviously going to be the same guy. I like the idea that it's a different guy because it's like, well, you don't need like what's the old joke that like anytime a character shows up who has any kind of darker skin, it's like, oh, they must be related to Lando. It's like, oh, well, every time a character shows up that is a Wookiee, it must be this Wookiee. I mean, and they did the same thing with like
Chewbacca's great grandfather.
yeah, it's Chewbacca's grandfather, it's his son, it's his brother. It's like, okay, not everyone needs to be related. Like you can have people over here doing that and doing their own thing. And it's just something stupid that fans always do. But it's so it's cool to see that like yes, there's more than one Wookiee Jedi. And again, just to again back on that theme of like the Jedi kind of becoming full of themselves, that like well, you look into the prequels and I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't remember there being any Wookiee Jedi in the prequels. And it maybe the Jedi said, well, we're too good for them and moved on
Mhm.
from it. But I don't know. But I mean, it's
But I,
interesting
th-
to see they had them before.
I think that when, if I remember correctly, that once the sides, maybe this was at the Empire, or it was at some point, the Wookiees kind of tried to neutralize, become neutral, and
Hmm.
um, kind of stay out of the politics of what was going on between the two sides, or the growing
Hmm.
divide of in the political ranks.
Well, the Wookiees have a really interesting story just in general with Star Wars, where they I- in if you're just watching the movies, like that you see that they were a planet that the Jedi align with during the Galactic Civil War, and they have that huge sequence on Kashyyyk in Revenge of the Sith where Yoda is fighting with the Wookiees, and that's kind of when Order 66 happens. But then you watch Solo, a Star Wars story, you watch Rebels, and you learn that the Wookiees were enslaved by the Empire, and then you kind of follow Chewbacca as kind of your main Wookiee after that to see kind of what they're up to. But I think it's super interesting to see that at one point the Wookiee were just as respected in the galaxy as anybody else, and they were there where there was Wookiee Jedi. So um, I think you're muted, Chad. There
Okay,
you go.
okay, good. I'll have to listen to see what you just said because my headphones cut out. So,
Oh.
but I'm sure it was, I mean, I really, I mean, overall, I think I like the show. Like you said, there were certain things that, some of the writing kind of seemed a little weak in spots.
Hmm.
Some of the dialogue, but overall, I mean, I also kind of I thought for sure once everybody started talking about what's his face Mundi appearing
Hmm.
that they were going to say something about the other the other one was Plo Koon because he shows up, one of the, an alien that looks like him shows up as part of the team that heads heads the planet to
Hmm.
look for uh, look for them, and it's like, please say that's not Platoon, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, the part of the show that really got me the most, and it was something that every time it happened, I would call a friend and just be like, "Dude, come on! Like, why do they keep doing this?" It was the worst, I think, in episode 6, but Soul would be doing something, and like he would be talking to somebody, and then he would slowly get to the point where he's about to reveal what he did in the past, and then something would happen and he wouldn't say it. And that happened probably 15 times in the show. And episode 6 was the worst because episode 6 would have he was on the ship with May, and
Yeah,
he'd be standing there and he'd be like, all right, well, so years, and then the lights would come on, and then he'd be like, oh, okay, and then he would, and the next scene he'd be fixing the ship, and then he'd be talking, and then okay, so I'm gonna finally, and then someone would start talking on the speaker, and you're like, how many times can you do this? That like, and it's funny because even in the last episode, they do the same thing where Soul is talking to, I think he's talking to May again, and he's trying to explain to her that like her and her sister were born from a virgins in the Force, and it's something that the audience already knows because we saw that flashback, and but it happens again where he's trying to explain it to her, and then she like runs away, and it's like Soul just gets the short end of the stick every time. Like this poor guy can never finish what he's trying to say.
yeah. I thought I don't know the actor's name. I know he was in Squid Game, but
Mhm.
I thought he did pretty good. I think I read somewhere that he modeled his character after Qui-Gon Jinn, and
It makes sense. Yeah.
kind of the way he presented himself and delivered his. I wish they had. I felt that like Torben, like there was kind of no reason for him to, have taken the poison because he he really didn't do anything in my opinion. He was just kind of trying to, follow Soul or and he
Hmm.
all he wanted to do was get back to Coruscant, really.
Well, and I had this whole thing that I connected after that episode that I don't think Kalnaka did anything wrong either. So at the beginning of the episode, he shows up on the planet with them. He goes into the fortress with them and talks, and then they leave. And Indara's like, "All right, let's go. We're not supposed to be here." And Kalnaka's like, "Yep, cool. I'm fine. Let's go." And then it's Torben and Soul who leave to go back. So Indara are like, "Well, crap. We need to go track him down." And when they get there, Kalnaka is immediately taken over by the witches. So then he attacks Torben, he attacks Soul, and then Indara uses the force to get the witches out of his head, which then like knock them out. But he did
Or kills.
absolutely, yeah, he did absolutely nothing wrong that whole time though. He was just like he was there to try to get his people out of the conflict to say let's go. Happened to get mind whammied, and then woke up on the ship for them to be like there was a fire, and it's like well for all he knew there probably just was a fire. He had no idea. Like
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they were trying to say like deep down he knew that he attacked his fellow
mhm.
Jedi, and that's kind of why he sequestered himself off on the planet, or I.
Or they told him what happened and he was just being part of the complicit idea of telling, like, lying about it. And that's
Mhm,
probably what it was just that, because I think the same thing for Torben, where you're right. Torben also had the mind whammy thing happen to him, and he was acting on based on what happened to him. Um, but he probably just felt the guilt over the years of knowing what kind of transpired, which ultimately was 90% Soul's fault, 10% uh, Indara's fault. I mean,
yeah.
Indar is guilty as the person who's, hey, I was in charge of the mission and I'm going to lie about what happened. And Soul is the one who went in and was like, all right, well, Torben's going crazy and I'm just going to use that as my in to get inside this place so I can get the person I want
Mhm,
and make her my Padawan. And it's like, okay, there's only so much that, like, I mean, like I said, at the end, it was really heartbreaking to see that Soul, till his death, said, I was doing the right thing. And it's
mhm.
like, but you weren't. Like, it's you were not doing the right thing, man.
And I think, and I'd probably have to watch it again, but the point where he actually kills the mother, it seems like he he had plenty of time. He waited long enough that he could have thought about what was going on, saw what was going on, and not, taken a different route. And
Yeah, I had some thoughts about that too, though, because I mean, again, I have to watch it again too, but I thought that that was in slow motion. So I thought the time that he had to do it was like, it was a slow motion kind of look into his thought process as he looked around and decided what to do. But I was telling a friend this as well, that the mom does the thing where she turns into smoke, right? And then May turns into smoke. And from Soul's perspective, he's like, all right, well, I just saw this lady turn into smoke. I've never seen anything like that before. I see the little girl I'm trying to save turn into smoke. She's clearly about to die or something. So then he stabs the mom. And it's like, I could see the way he's reacting there. I also saw an interview with the showrunner where she said that the mother was using that power to try to get the daughter away from the conflict.
mhm,
So, but I don't see how Soul would have known that because he didn't know what she was doing. All
mhm,
he's seen is these witches use their power to take over the mind of one of his friends, and he's seen them act in a very cult-like behavior and try to manipulate one of the little girls to be part of, like, the larger cult when she clearly doesn't want to be. So,
mhm,
yes, he was wrong to infiltrate and kind of stick his nose where it doesn't belong, but when he killed the mom, I mean, he knew from what he saw, she was doing something really bizarre that possibly could have been injuring one of the girls. And he was like, well, I need to save her.
mhm.
So it was, I don't almost don't blame him for the death of the mother. But then again, he would not have been in that situation in the first place if he had just listened to what the council said and moved on.
And another thing I just remembered, I think it's episode 6 when when they're showing like the flashback from the different perspective, and he like comes to the witch's cast fortress, and he's like, I said, okay, he's just going to force jump up the wall. No, he goes climb, climb.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, that kind of seems a little
Well, it's
just.
funny because they show up to the fortress at the end, um, in the last episode, and I almost expected them to do the same thing because they had that whole scene where it's like, oh well, the door's locked. How do we get in? And I'm like, well, last time you just climbed up the roof. Just do that again. Um, I I had a thought about Torben as well because you're right. I don't think he needed to have that period uh, of self-imposed silence and then take the poison because his guilt kind of was a little bizarre. But I almost don't see the point of his character in the first place because if they really wanted to, they could have had the witches use their mind whammy thing on Soul at the beginning, which
Hmm.
would have then manipulated him to go back. But
Hmm.
instead, they kind of worked around it where it was like, well, they use it on Torben, who goes back, and then Soul goes, well, that's my opportunity to go back as well, and follows Torben. It's like, Torben was really just kind of there to be there in the episode. Like, he didn't really, and also to create that hit list of who else to kill. And same with Indara, where like you could have had Indara and Kalnaka's characters probably combined as well, and instead, like they used their they used whatever budget they had to get Carrie Ann Moss to play a Star Wars character, where she,
and then
yeah,
do Matrix moves.
yeah, and she dies in the first 5 minutes doing Matrix moves, and then comes back in 2 episodes that are both flashbacks of the same sequence from different perspectives. It's like, okay, well, I mean, I don't really see there. And the other thing too, and I don't know if you've read about this, but apparently there was a scene shot of May when she killed Kalnaka, and in the show they approach his base, the one that you had mentioned was made out of wood, and they open the door and he's lying there dead with the lightsaber wound. Or actually, no, it was I think it was Kamir who killed Kalnaka. It wasn't May.
Yeah. I think it was because didn't May find him dead?
Yes, yeah. But apparently, and I've read this in a lot of different places, so I hope it's factual, but apparently the show had filmed that sequence and it was just too much of a budget for them, so they cut it. But that would have been really cool to see. I mean, for a lot of these characters, you don't really get much time to spend with them, other than the twins, Kamir, Sol, and somewhat Venestra. You don't really get a lot of time to spend with some of these side characters. By the time you really get to know Yord and Jecki, they die. Like
Yeah.
you finally get, you're like, okay, these are interesting characters. They're complex. Oh, they're dead. Okay, moving on.
I mean, there was. I think after the first couple episodes, everybody's like, "Well, Yord is the Dark Master." It's like, how do you make that leap?
Well, there was a lot of. I agreed with you where I thought originally that the mother was going to be the Dark Master because it would have, I think, made sense.
Mhm.
Um, but there was a lot of stuff with just the way I think it was obvious from the beginning. A lot of people kind of said, "Well, it's Kamir, obviously, because like he's in the show. Like, what else is he doing? He's on the planet." And like, I don't think I thought that Yord was, but I knew he was just a jerk. Like that was
Yeah.
immediately obvious. He's a jerk. He's arrogant. He's emblematic of the kind of Jedi they're trying to talk about. Um, but
Well,
they,
he says that Osha's guilty, and she's been on the ship, doing
mhm,
the repair thing the whole time.
yeah, and because he wants to be right. Almost, he's like, "Oh, I'm right because she did it," and it's like, "Well, you don't know that, but you're gonna think that because you're Yord and you want to be right all the time." But I mean, just touching on Osha and May a little bit, uh, just another thing that bothered me about the show, the child actors who played them in the flashback. I I have never been a big fan of child actors because only like 30% of the time do they do a good job. I do not think the two little girls they hired to play did a very good job playing these characters. It just kind of
I think
it was
that was some of the dialogue that didn't, it was kind of
yeah.
simplistic and kind of basic, and the delivery just wasn't convincing.
Yeah, and it really needs to be because you have this like again a space witch coven who you've never seen before, and you really need to sell that on Star Wars fans to say who are these characters who kind of pose somewhat of a threat to the Jedi. And then you have these two child actors who kind of don't sell the scene very well, and you go, and then there's the whole song they sing, the power of one, the power of two, the power of
Yeah, that
many.
was
The,
like that was kind of hokey.
well, and it's funny because in the last episode, I don't know if you watched the credits, but they play that song again in the credits. And I was like, why? I mean, I thought the finale was good. And I'm like, but then you play that song, and I'm like, oh, you reminded me of like the worst part of the show, like just. Um, but the other thing, and this is a problem I've posted about it a few times on Twitter, but the finale, like I think that if they ended the finale about 3/4 the way through, they would have stuck the landing. But
Mhm.
the last quarter of the finale was all setting up the next season, where it was like, all right, so the conflict with Soul has ended. Um, May and Osha are now going to escape. Kamir is going to go do his thing. He's going to try to bring them in. And then they do the whole thing where he does the mind wipe on May, which I'm like, oh,
Yeah,
it's that easy to do. Okay. Um, and it's funny because you watch like the uh, the Force Awakens, where Kylo Ren is doing he's using the Force to try to interrogate Rey, and like
she's like,
it's portrayed as
she's
like this
like, "What are you
super,
doing?"
yeah, it's like a painful thing to do, and like she's like screaming while it's happening, but then he goes to whammy May, who was clearly like cooperative in it. She wanted it to happen, but it was like he stands there and goes like this, and then who are you people? And it's like you. It was that fast. It was that easy. Like at least be lying about it. Like come on.
Or at least sell try to sell me that Khmer's not that powerful of a you know
Mm-hmm.
Sith Lord. I mean,
Well, and the thing is like I I got the impression that that's what they were going for, that he wasn't that powerful, and I only think that because when they're fighting in episode 5, I think it's Soul who makes the comment, but he says there's no predictability with his movements, or I think it's Yord actually, who's like he's erratic. He's swinging his lightsaber, he's doing stuff, but we can't predict his movements because he's not moving using like the trained techniques and the forms that the Jedi use. So I chalk that up as like, well, maybe he's not super powerful, but he's aware of what the Jedi do. He knows their teachings, and he's manipulating that by doing things that they wouldn't expect. But
Mhm.
then you get to the end, and he's like, oh, "Mind wipe, I'm the coolest person ever." You're like, "All right." I mean, at the end of the day, like, if I'm going to buy an action figure, I'm buying the Khmer action figure because he's definitely the coolest character of the show. But that part was like, oh, come on, man. You were so close. You were so close. If they didn't do that, then I would have been like, this finale was great. This show stuck the landing. But they did that part, and I was like, oh man. And then they have this stuff where it's like, okay, Vanestra is going to lie to the council, which we knew she was going to do. The Senate starts to get involved, which is kind of a predecessor to like leading up to future stuff with the prequels. You have Kamir training or starting to train May and like holding her hand. So it's like, well, are they in a relationship too? Like that's kind of weird. Um, and then you have Vanestra kind of recruiting May, where
Yeah,
where she's like, "So you're going to help me find your sister?" She's like, "My sister?" And you're like, "Oh yeah, that's right. You got
whisper.
my yeah." And she's like, "You're going to help me find my Padawan," and it's like, okay, that's cool. That's interesting. I just they put basically so much faith in there being another season of the show that if there's not, it's going to be like, oh, come on. Now they need to make a comic book about it, which they would. They would probably make a
Yeah,
book or a comic book to say what happens, but
I mean, I'm sure like they usually do with the Disney shows. There'll be a comic book adaptation of it, and
mhm.
those they're kind of hit and miss because I like the Obi-Wan Kenobi one. I couldn't read it because even though it was Salvador LaRocca art, it was just like the faces looked so weird. It was like we're trying to look like the actors, but we're not.
Mhm. Yeah, the honestly the best ones are the comic book adaptations of the books. So there's the Thrawn books, not the well, I guess they did for the older Thrawn books too, but for
You're talking about
the
Jody Hauser ones.
the canon Thrawn books. I think
Yeah,
it maybe yeah, Jody Hauser.
it was Jody
Um,
Hauser. Yep.
those do a great job of pulling the narrative from the book and putting it into comic form. But you're right. I think it was I think it was also Obi-Wan that I opened and I was like, oh, it's a or it may have been the Mandalorian. One of those ones where I opened it and was like, I know what it looks like because I've watched the show, and that's not what that looks like. And again, Salvador Larroca, great artist, he does a great job. But like, it's it, it's not like it's almost like if the MCU movies had come before the comics, and then you try to read the comics and you're like, what is Thanos wearing? It's like,
Yeah.
well, but in Star Wars it is one of those properties that like it's unique in that manner where I mean Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, I mean a lot of these big Lord of the Rings, all of these like big fantasy or science fiction properties started in like a book form and then were adapted into a movie. But you have Star Wars, which started as these classic, like super movies that are still held to a high regard, like movies from the 70s and 80s. And so now when you're adapting it and doing stuff in TV, you're doing stuff in movies, it's not like you're adapting a comic book and you can kind of have liberties with it. You still have to make sure that that original source material makes sense and doesn't look hokey or weird. Even Star Trek, which is a lot older, but like even Star Trek you look at and you're like, all right, I can watch the original trilogy of Star Trek and then watch it now and go, all right, that clearly had a terrible budget back then and when the show was made. But with Star Wars, it was like, well, it was this big budget movie that George Lucas had all these crazy ideas for that came to life. And now anything you have needs to make sure that that old movie from the 70s still looks good. And it does. It always, I mean, Star Wars always has held up to me. But it kind of serves as a limitation to the show. And then to again our point for the comic books too, where it's like, well, now we know what it should look like, and then when the comics show up, you go, no, that's not Obi-Wan.
And like when I reviewed the first Ahsoka comic book, it's like it hit all the right story beats, and I didn't have a chance to like watch the show and make compare how well it did, but there were just a couple things with the art, like the perspective shots that kind of look really off to me.
Mm-hmm.
The heights of the characters, and it kind of took me out.
Well, and I think it goes both ways too. Like, there's been a lot of talk of like James Gunn's DC universe adapting something like The Human Target, and ironically, that's the book that's right behind me there. But it it that's a book that very much, like, the art is such a huge part of it that if you tried to get Greg Smallwood's art and bring it to life, you'd almost be doing a disservice to Greg Smallwood.
Mm-hmm.
And Star Wars works as the inverse of that, where like no matter how good the artist is, even Alex Ross could draw a Star Wars book and it would still not look like it appeared on the show because you know what it's supposed to look like and you know how it's supposed to feel.
And again, with the Inquisitor's book, the Grand Inquisitor, he's such a his the elongated head. It's just
Mm-hmm.
from panel to panel, it kind of looks different, and or it looks off the mark sometimes, and it kind of it throws me off when I'm reading.
Well, and then it doesn't help that the Obi-Wan show, when the Grand Inquisitor shows up, he just looks completely wrong. Like his head is like circular, and it's like, okay, dude, what are you even trying to do there? But I mean, that's where the Acolyte had a really good benefit going to it, though, is that the Acolyte was able to, I mean, because it had no other than, like we mentioned, Venestra, but no other character who appeared as kind of like a main part of the show was truly established in lore enough for you to go, that doesn't look right. Because
Right.
you don't know what those people look like. This is the first time you're seeing them. So you're really setting up that for it to look like something new and something exciting. I loved the costume design with the yellow
Mhm.
robes. And I mean, you talk about the High Republic, the Golden Age. I mean, you have these like yellow goldish robes. Like that was a really cool design.
I think the only character that you could even make that comment about would be Mundi, because he's obviously a whole lot younger there, and
Mm-hmm.
than he is in the prequels.
Well, speaking of characters who are younger, Yoda. Yoda shows up at the end,
Yeah,
and he
yeah.
looks as old as he does. He looks older than he did in like the Phantom Menace, and I'm like, okay, I thought that we were gonna like. I mean, he doesn't need to have like jet black hair, but like, I thought that we were gonna get a Yoda who. I mean, he could have been bald. I mean, I
I
didn't
mean,
think
he
he
would
was gonna
probably
be
be
an old
what
man.
is about 700 years old then.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at Grogu, who is the only really other than Yaddle, but the only other really version of that species that you're used to, and like it makes sense that like I think Grogu is what like 50 years old in the Mandalorian, but he's still a child. So it makes sense that it's like, okay, well, even though it's 100 years ago, Yoda's still this old man. But I thought it would have been interesting to see, and I haven't gotten too far into the High Republic books and comics, but I thought it would have been interesting to see a version of Yoda who's not part of the council, who is just
Well, I think
still.
even in the High Republic, he's the head guy.
But doesn't that like ruin the character of Yoda though? Where it's like, okay, wait, so now Yoda was not complicit, but he was there during not
Yeah,
only these two like horrible lies that the Jedi told about what happened to hide their own self-interest, but also during the entire rise of the Sith. He was the leader of the Jedi. Like it's like Yoda is almost the villain of Star Wars at that point. That he would just let
yeah.
all that happen.
I think we figured it out.
Yeah. I know a lot of people want to say it's Jar Jar Binks, but I think it's Yoda.
Yeah.
That Jar Jar Binks one is my favorite like piece of headcanon ever that that Jar Jar Binks was actually the Sith leader the whole time and he just acted stupid like kind of like Yoda did in the Empire Strikes Back. That's always been my favorite piece of like headcanon that goes, I see what George Lucas was doing and but he just never did that.
Yeah, but I also kind of like how, as we've, with what is it, been 25, they just celebrated 25 years of the Phantom Menace. Hard to
Mhm.
believe. That means I'm old. But it's kind of nice how they've made taken his character and tried to redeem him, like Chuck Wendig does it in his Aftermath series, as he's like a he's on a planet, and he's like entertaining children who've been orphaned, and in the 25th anniversary Phantom Menace special, he has a really Greg Pak gives him a really poignant moment with a young Anakin that is very un Jar Jar like, but still kind of cool and going to redeeming. I mean, they even did it during the Clone Wars. The cartoon kind of, even though he was still like the full fool, they had him at least try to do things that were good, or not totally stupid.
Well, and it's funny too because like that it's almost like another example of like the hubris of the Jedi, but or how much they like hated the Senate, where they're like, "All right, Senate, you're a thorn in our side. We don't like you. We're gonna find the dumbest guy in the galaxy, and we're gonna make him join the Senate." It's like, and then anytime he shows up after, it's he's a senator, and then he
Mm-hmm.
seemingly dies in Order 66, which is it's just funny. Actually, I think you're right. Chuck in the Chuck Wendig books, don't they reveal how he died in Order 66,
No, he didn't die in Order 66. No,
or that he got
just
away or something and became like a
he
homeless
got away,
guy?
and he's on a planet. He's on a planet, and he's like doing his clown thing, being a clown ish thing to entertain the
Got
kids,
it.
and
Okay.
so
It's it's just funny that he's the character that gets the happy ending. Out of all the things, it's just
oh,
it's so
it's all
stupid.
it all comes back to Jar Jar. You know.
It is. My favorite take on the Phantom Menace is a friend I have who will kill me for saying this, but he was like the only person on the planet who liked the Phantom Menace because of the politics. He like pursued a career like and entertainment in politics because of what he liked in the Phantom Menace. I'm like, that's what like most people hate about the Phantom Menace is that like there's these long like almost courtroom scenes that just go on forever of them talking about
I
trade
object,
agreements.
and they don't do it any favors in the Clone Wars either. In the later season, it's like, okay, we get that you gotta do something in the Senate. Okay, Ahsoka is being brought to trial by the Senate. It's kind of. boring.
Yeah. And well, and again, that's again part of that narrative too, that Ahsoka thing about the Jedi's hubris and where they're so quick to accept that Ahsoka's guilty,
Hmm.
and then she gets cast out of the Jedi, and then ultimately decides not to want to come back, and like it it Dave Filoni knew what he was building up to when he did that. I think it was clear that he knew what he was doing there, and it's always been a shock to me, and I'll be the one of the few fans who says it, but like I'm a fan of The Last Jedi. I actually have a Last Jedi tattoo on my arm. But uh The Last Jedi, it was like my favorite part of that whole movie, where Luke refuses to continue the path of the Jedi because he knows that the Jedi failed so horribly because of what they did. And it's like there was just so many fans at the time and still now who refuse to accept that, like, well, but no, the Jedi were the good guys. And it's like, but they weren't, though. That's the
Yeah.
whole point of the
Well,
prequels, is that, yeah.
and I was, and this is something I was brought up in another interview today. Like that's the thing I don't like about like the canon or the legends like story after after the Jedi. It's like Luke, you know, becomes this all almost all powerful force god and
Mhm.
can do no wrong and like closes a black hole or something. It's like he's still human.
Well, and he learned nothing from his entire experience. Almost, it was
Yeah.
like the Jedi got so powerful, and because they were so blinded by how powerful they were, they let the Sith in, and the Sith took over. But he's going to go and recreate the Jedi Order and do the same thing again. And it's that joke
Cyclical.
from a Rick and Morty episode where I forgot what the episode was called, but it's where they go into that simulation where it's like they live the life of that guy who worked at the rug store, and when Rick goes through it, he like quits the rug store and like goes off and becomes this like super famous guy. But when Morty does it, he works at the rug store and like hates his life, has a heart attack, and then comes back and then works at the drugstore or at the rug store, and a rug falls on him and kills him. And Rick tells him, "Well, you went back to the rug store. Who? No one goes back to the rug store. Like you don't go back and do it again." Like I always think of that when stuff like that happens, where it's like, no, it doesn't make sense that Luke would have recreated the Jedi Order, knowing the exact reason they failed. Because, I mean, that's like the constant lesson in history of like, well, I can do it better because I know what happened. It's like, well, everyone says that, and then it all fails again. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
obviously that's going to happen again. So I like the seeds of the Jedi's destruction are sowed hundreds of years before the Phantom Menace. That's
Hmm.
really interesting to me.
Well, we are almost an hour and 20 minutes, so why don't we kind of wrap things up? On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the first season of The Acolyte?
I'm gonna say 7.5.
Hmm. I'd give it an 8. And again, a lot of my um, qualms about it are not kind of connecting it to the stuff, even tangentially, to the 2 to 3 years of back matter that was created, you know, because the High Republic was supposed to be this huge, new initiative that, kind of linked this era all together. And then, you know, but
Yeah,
again, the Acolyte also works as, kind of a standalone. And if you have the knowledge of the stuff that happens in the back, in the past, then it just kind of makes the story a little more fuller as it usually does.
yeah, and I would have rated it higher, but my problems were nothing really to do with the Star Wars aspects of it, but there was some filmmaking problems. I mentioned the problems I had with the acting in some of the scenes, the plot contrivances, and a lot of the plot things they use over again. The well, I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it. Oh, got distracted. Like, and those are the things that kind of held it back for me, where it was a cool Star Wars show, and I liked what they did, and a lot of the parts I really loved, like the action, but just just the like the film part of it, like the
Mhm.
part of trying to make it a cohesive TV show, and like having those kind of problems are what really held it back for me.
I agree, and hopefully that it does get a second season. And
I agree.
um, I'm kind of interested in Skeleton Crew, which is it coming out later this supposed to come out later this year?
Yeah, I think they may have a trailer for it at Comic Con. I don't know, but I've heard that they may do that, but that does look interesting to see because it's a I don't remember what his name is, but
Jude Law.
uh, yeah, Jude Law, and he's supposedly like this kind of traveler in the galaxy, and then there's these kids that come with him. It's a cool story that sounds kind of disconnected from a lot of what we have come to be used to with Star Wars, so it sounds like really cool.
Well, and I think that's what the areas of Star Wars can branch out. I mean, Andor proved that you don't need to have lightsabers,
Hmm.
and that I mean, if you love the politics of Star Wars, and that's kind of your real world slash Star Wars
Yeah.
real world. You know, everything is sucks and is going to hell.
Hmm.
And then I would also like to I'd like to see them like adapt books like the one about Tarkin,
Hmm.
his life and growing up, and again, maybe somehow adapt Ethan Sacks's Bounty Hunters. That would be cool to see. Just you know more not kind of spinning off of the Mandalorian, but Bosk and Zuckuss and 4L Rom and
Or
all
even
the
Kieran Gillen's Darth Vader was really
yeah.
cool.
I mean, if they wanted to give Hayden Christensen a another you know run time as Darth Vader, um, the book what is it, Lords of the Sith, where he and um, Palpatine are trapped on Ryloth
Hmm.
because the Twi'leks are able to blast their ship, and again that also ties into the lore that's in um, Star Wars Rebels, because it's Hera's father who's kind of the guy who is trying to get rid of
Hmm.
the two of them. So I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff that they could do, and whether or not they should is far above my pay grade. So
Yeah. Exactly.
well, I want to thank you for taking the time this evening, and I'm sure we could probably chat for about Star Wars for hours on end. But
I'm sure. Yeah.
maybe once we find out a little bit more about Skeleton Crew, or once that comes out, we can do something like this again, and
Yeah.
it'd be fun. And again, great to finally chat with you in person. And I'll see you on the board. And as Matt likes to say during the show, the world can be a crappy place. Uh, do something nice, read something good, and we'll be back next week with our regular show. I think we're going to kind of do a San Diego Comic Con roundtable, talk about the Eisners and stuff like that. So more on that as next week goes, and the Comic Watchers will return.